February 22, 2024. In the peaceful town of Athens, Georgia, 22-year-old Laken Riley went for her usual morning jog, never to return. By the time the sun set, her life had been brutally stolen, leaving behind a community in shock. This is the heartbreaking story of how Laken's morning run ended in violence, and how her untimely death became a symbol of both personal tragedy and public outrage. Laken Riley was a bright, compassionate nursing student who had just transferred to the University of Georgia to pursue her dream of becoming a pediatric nurse. A lover of children, she was passionate about helping others, often seen volunteering or studying late into the night. On the morning of February 22, 2024, she set out for her usual jog through the nearby park, unaware that her routine would be shattered forever. She was an avid runner, jogging up to 6 times a week, sometimes with her friends, but that morning, she decided to run alone. Little did she know, just moments after leaving her home near campus, her life would be brutally interrupted by a stranger. Her journey that day would come to a tragic and horrifying end, all before anyone could even begin to process the horror that was unfolding. On the morning of February 22, 2024, Laken Riley left her home near the University of Georgia's campus to go for her usual jog. A 22-year-old nursing student with dreams of becoming a pediatric nurse, she had a well-established routine. Almost every morning, Laken would run along the winding paths of the intramural fields, a place she knew well. The park, a vast area filled with soccer fields, tennis courts, and scenic trails, was a popular spot for students looking to stay active. She had always been a disciplined runner, usually jogging 3 to 6 times a week, often with her friend Connolly by her side. But that morning, for reasons no one could explain, she chose to run alone. As she left her apartment just after 9 a.m., the crisp morning air filled her lungs, and with her headphones securely in place, she started her jog. Her smartwatch tracked her steps, and the faint sound of music was almost drowned by the rhythmic beat of her shoes against the pavement. She had no idea that this peaceful, everyday moment would be the last time she would feel safe, and that the world she knew would shift forever. Just minutes into her run, Laken's life was interrupted. It was a brief moment of normalcy before the terror began. As she jogged past the bus stop, she was alone. Her phone was in her hand, and 2 white AirPods were nestled in her ears, connecting her to the music that usually accompanied her runs. It was quiet, the sounds of nature and her footfalls were all she could hear. But a few minutes later, her phone's location would tell a different story. At 9:28 a.m., Laken's movements came to an abrupt halt. Her smartwatch recorded the exact moment when her body stopped. Less than a minute later, a muffled 911 call was made from her phone. The faint sounds captured on the call were chilling: footsteps, scuffling, and the unmistakable sound of struggle. The call, lasting barely a minute, was all the clues investigators would have for some time. There were no words spoken, just muffled sounds of distress before the line went silent. The call was disconnected, and after that, there was nothing. No more calls. No more signs of life. Her phone, however, was still active. The location pinged for several minutes before it too went still. The phone's GPS pointed to a wooded area, just a short distance off the main trail she would typically run. It was an area that Laken had passed many times, but now, it had become a place of darkness. The unknown had found its way into her world, and it would never let her go. Back at her apartment, Laken's roommates, Connolly, Lily, and Sophia, began to worry. Laken was a creature of habit. She always came back after her runs, often with a smile on her face, eager to chat about her morning or listen to the latest gossip. But that morning, there was no sign of her. Connolly had sent several texts, but there was no response. By 11:15 a.m., confusion turned to concern as missed calls and unread messages piled up. Lily, growing increasingly worried, checked Laken's location using the shared phone feature. She found that Laken's phone was still in the same spot, near the wooded area behind the park. Without wasting time, the 3 roommates set out in search of Laken, hoping to find her lost but safe. As they walked through the park, they couldn't shake the feeling that something was horribly wrong. The air seemed thicker now, filled with the weight of anxiety. They searched for over an hour, retracing the path Laken had likely taken. It wasn't like her to disappear without notice. They were sure she was somewhere, maybe lost or hurt, but they never could have imagined the reality they would soon face. The search for Laken Riley had only just begun, and the truth was darker than anyone could have known. After an intense investigation, the pieces of the puzzle finally came together. José Ibarra, a Venezuelan immigrant living in Athens, Georgia, was arrested and charged with multiple crimes, the most serious being the brutal murder of Laken Riley. The evidence against him was overwhelming, evidence that painted a clear and undeniable picture of his involvement in this horrific crime. Ibarra's arrest came after weeks of painstaking detective work. Police had uncovered a trail of bloodied clothing, discarded items, and surveillance footage that connected him directly to the scene of Laken's murder. His DNA was found on Laken's body and under her fingernails, confirming what investigators had feared. His fingerprints were discovered on her phone, where he had left his mark after an attempt to stop her from calling for help. It was clear that Laken had fought for her life, and in the end, she had been overpowered by someone who would later be identified as Ibarra. The charges against him were numerous and brutal: malice murder, felony murder, kidnapping, attempted rape, and assault with intent to commit a crime. He had forced Laken off the trail, dragged her into the woods, and tried to silence her. The physical evidence, including a blood-stained jacket, black gloves, and DNA samples, left little room for doubt. The case was solid, and Ibarra's fate seemed inevitable. As the news of his arrest spread, the local community, as well as Laken's family and friends, began to process the weight of what had happened. This wasn't just a random act of violence, it was well calculated, it was brutal, and it shattered the peace of a town that had never imagined something like this could happen. The arrest was the first step toward justice, but the real battle would soon begin in the courtroom. The trial of José Ibarra was nothing short of a battle for justice. It was a case that captivated the community, leaving them with more questions than answers, but ultimately, it would serve as a testament to the power of evidence in the pursuit of truth. The courtroom became a stage where the weight of Laken Riley's life and death would be examined, dissected, and put on display for all to see. But no matter how hard the defense team tried, the truth about what had happened to Laken was clear. The prosecution's case was airtight. Witnesses testified, and the evidence was irrefutable. The prosecution laid out a timeline of the events, showing how Laken's life had ended in violence mere minutes after she had been separated from the safety of her usual routine. They highlighted the DNA evidence, the fingerprints on Laken's phone, and the bloody gloves discarded in the dumpster near Ibarra's apartment. They also presented the damning surveillance footage showing a man, later identified as Ibarra, disposing of the bloody jacket in the early hours of the morning. Despite this overwhelming evidence, Ibarra's defense team attempted to deflect, arguing that he had not intended to harm Laken, that the crime was a series of unfortunate circumstances that spiraled out of control. They suggested that perhaps it was a case of mistaken identity, or that someone else had been responsible for the murder. But their arguments fell on deaf ears. The prosecution had already demonstrated, beyond any reasonable doubt, that José Ibarra had been the one to end Laken Riley's life. The emotional testimony of Laken's family further strengthened the prosecution's case. Her mother, father, and younger sister took the stand, sharing their grief and their loss. They spoke of Laken's dreams, her bright future, and the impact her death had on their lives. Their words brought the case from the abstract into the realm of the personal. The jury could see the depth of the pain that Ibarra's actions had caused. Throughout the trial, Ibarra showed little emotion. He sat quietly, listening as the details of his crime were laid bare. His eyes often stared into space, avoiding the gaze of those who had come to testify. There was no remorse, no hint of regret. And while the defense tried to muddy the waters, there was no question in anyone's mind that Ibarra was guilty. In the end, the trial was more than just a legal process, it was a reckoning. Laken's family finally had the chance to see the man who had taken their daughter, their sister, and their friend, brought to justice. And though nothing could ever bring Laken back, they hoped that the trial would bring them some semblance of closure. The murder of Laken Riley, while a deeply personal tragedy for her family and friends, quickly became the subject of national attention. As the details of the case emerged, so too did the complexities surrounding the suspect, José Ibarra. Ibarra, an immigrant from Venezuela, had entered the United States seeking refuge from the political unrest in his home country. But the discovery that he was living in the U.S. illegally would ignite a firestorm of political debate and public outcry. Critics argued that Ibarra's presence in the country was an example of a failed immigration system. Many claimed that had he been detained earlier for his previous criminal activities, Laken would still be alive. This view was amplified by those who believed the government had not done enough to ensure that individuals like Ibarra, who were in the country illegally, were not allowed to slip through the cracks. In the aftermath of Laken's murder, there were calls from all corners for stricter immigration enforcement, with many claiming that the system had failed to protect its citizens. Political leaders, both local and national, were quick to weigh in. Some conservative lawmakers pushed for more stringent immigration policies, calling for laws that would more aggressively target undocumented immigrants with criminal backgrounds. They argued that the tragic events surrounding Laken's death were evidence that current policies were too lenient and that change was necessary to prevent similar tragedies in the future. They insisted that if Ibarra had been detained or deported earlier, Laken's life could have been spared. On the other side of the debate, immigration advocates and supporters of immigrant rights cautioned against using a single case as justification for sweeping legislative change. They warned against painting all immigrants with the same brush, stressing that the vast majority of immigrants, including those seeking asylum, posed no threat to society. They argued that criminalizing all undocumented individuals, based on the actions of one person, was unfair and would only fuel discrimination and division within communities. These voices called for a more measured approach, one that focused on reforming the immigration system in a fair and humane way. As the political debate raged on, the murder of Laken Riley had inadvertently become a flashpoint for the larger conversation about immigration in America. Lawmakers began proposing new bills and reforms, often referencing the case as an example of why the system needed an overhaul. The case had become a battleground for those advocating for stricter immigration laws and those calling for a more compassionate, nuanced approach to immigration reform. What had started as a personal tragedy was now entangled in the politics of immigration, as the nation struggled to find common ground. While the political world wrestled with the implications of Laken's murder, the public's reaction was filled with a mixture of grief, outrage, and confusion. The case, which had already captured national attention, quickly became a topic of heated discussions across social media, news outlets, and communities. But as much as the case sparked political debates, it also deeply affected those who had known Laken personally. For Laken's family, the pain of her loss was immeasurable. Her mother, father, and younger sister, Lauren, were shattered by the brutal reality that their loved one was taken from them in such a violent and senseless manner. The family had to face not only the heartbreak of losing Laken but also the media attention that came with it. News outlets camped outside their home, and every aspect of their lives, from their mourning to their private grief, became fodder for public consumption. Yet, amidst the cameras and microphones, they remained steadfast in their calls for justice for Laken. The family's grief quickly became intertwined with the political narrative, as the story of Laken's murder became a talking point for those on both sides of the immigration debate. The Riley family was not just mourning the loss of their daughter, they were also being pulled into a broader conversation that they had never asked for. As reporters pressed them for statements, some members of the family struggled with the media circus that surrounded them, while others became vocal advocates for justice and change. Laken's father, Jason Riley, spoke out publicly, calling for justice and demanding accountability for Ibarra's actions. He, like many others, was appalled by the fact that Ibarra had been allowed to remain in the country despite his criminal history. But even as the media rushed to cover the story from every angle, it was clear that the Riley family was most focused on their daughter's legacy and the pursuit of justice for her. Their message was simple: no matter how the case was politicized, Laken was more than a statistic. She was a young woman with a future ahead of her, a life that had been stolen far too soon. Meanwhile, members of the public, many of whom had never met Laken, were also deeply moved by her story. Social media was flooded with tributes, hashtags, and calls for justice. People shared their sorrow and anger at the injustice of her death. Her tragic story resonated with countless individuals, who saw in Laken not just a victim, but a person whose life had been full of promise. The outpouring of support for the Riley family was overwhelming, but it was also a reminder of how deeply the nation had been shaken by the events of that morning. As the story continued to unfold, it was impossible to ignore the way in which the public's grief had become tied to the larger political discourse. The lines between the personal and the political had blurred. Laken's family was grieving, but they were also facing the harsh reality that their daughter's death had become part of a larger debate about immigration, justice, and the country's laws. They did not ask for their daughter's name to become a symbol. But that's exactly what it had become, a symbol of loss, of injustice, and, in the eyes of many, a symbol of a broken system. In the end, the Riley family's message remained the same: they wanted justice for Laken. But as the case gained more national attention, it became clear that Laken's story would not just be a story of loss, it would be a story of how tragedy can spark change, how personal grief can collide with the broader issues of society, and how the pursuit of justice can bring both healing and division. After weeks of emotional testimony, intense legal arguments, and mounting evidence, the trial of Jose Ibarra came to a close. The courtroom was tense as the jury returned to deliver its verdict. Laken's family, the prosecution, and even the defense were waiting, knowing that the moment of truth was finally at hand. When the judge began reading the verdict, it was clear that the case had been made overwhelmingly clear by the prosecution. Jose Ibarra was found guilty on all counts: malice murder, felony murder, kidnapping, attempted rape, and more. There was no ambiguity. His actions, his violent attack on Laken Riley, had been laid bare for all to see, and the jury's decision reflected the evidence that had been carefully gathered over the weeks of the trial. Laken's family, who had watched every day of the proceedings, could finally breathe a collective sigh of relief, though it was only a fleeting moment. The verdict had come, and justice had been served, but it would never bring Laken back. Her mother, father, and sister were in tears as they heard the words they had longed to hear, yet they also knew that the emotional scars would remain. No guilty verdict, no legal punishment, could erase the pain of losing Laken in such a brutal and senseless way. Across the courtroom, Ibarra sat motionless. He had not shown any emotion during the trial, and even now, as the judge read the charges and the jury's decision, he remained still. It was as if the gravity of his actions had not yet sunk in. But for Laken's family and friends, the weight of the moment was heavy with both relief and sorrow. The question of whether justice had truly been done lingered in their hearts. Could anything really bring true justice to the loss they had suffered? The guilty verdict, while necessary, was only a small piece in the long road to healing. As the courtroom slowly emptied, Laken's family and the public began to process the outcome. The emotions were raw: anger, sorrow, relief, but above all, there was a sense of finality. The man who had taken Laken's life would pay for his actions, but the cost of that payment was a life lost, a future stolen, and a family forever changed. With the verdict now behind them, the next step in the legal process was the sentencing. The question on everyone's mind was clear: what punishment should be given to a man who had taken the life of an innocent young woman so brutally? Jose Ibarra was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge, after considering the severity of his crimes, determined that Ibarra's actions had forfeited any chance of freedom. The sentence was meant to reflect the gravity of the murder, the violence he had inflicted on Laken, and the terror he had caused her in her final moments. There would be no second chances for Ibarra; he would spend the rest of his life behind bars. For Laken's family, the sentence was a bittersweet victory. Her mother, father, and sister were present in the courtroom during the sentencing, their faces a mixture of emotions. On one hand, they felt a sense of justice. Ibarra would never walk free again. But on the other hand, the enormity of their loss was undeniable. No prison sentence could ever undo the damage that had been done to their family, and no amount of time in prison could bring Laken back. There was also a strong public reaction to the sentence. While some were satisfied with the life sentence, others called for the death penalty. In the wake of Laken's murder, many felt that Ibarra's actions deserved the ultimate punishment. They believed that anything less than death would be an insufficient consequence for such a heinous crime. The debate over the death penalty had been a recurring theme throughout the case, and it reached a fever pitch now that the sentence had been handed down. Opponents of the death penalty argued that a life sentence was the proper punishment, as it ensured Ibarra would never see freedom again. They contended that executing him would not bring Laken back and that life in prison was a more fitting and humane way to deal with someone who had committed such an unforgivable act. For them, the sentencing was a reflection of the justice system's commitment to rehabilitation, even if Ibarra's crimes seemed beyond redemption. On the other side, those who advocated for the death penalty argued that Ibarra's brutal actions warranted the ultimate punishment. They believed that by taking Laken's life in such a violent and premeditated way, Ibarra had forfeited his own right to live. For them, the sentencing of life in prison felt like a failure of the justice system to fully hold him accountable for the devastation he had caused. The debate over the death penalty continued in the aftermath of the sentencing, but for Laken's family, there was no satisfaction in this debate. Their focus was on the fact that no amount of punishment could ever truly compensate for the loss of Laken. Her life had been stolen, and all the punishment in the world could not bring her back. They would have to find a way to heal, to carry on without her. And though justice had been served in the eyes of the law, the emotional scars left behind by her death would last a lifetime. Laken Riley's life was tragically taken too soon, but her story is far from over. In the wake of her death, the world witnessed the strength of her character and the depth of her dreams. Laken had a future ahead of her, one that was filled with promise and ambition. She was determined to become a pediatric nurse, someone who would have cared for children with the same kindness and compassion she showed to everyone around her. She loved life, her family, and her work. She had so much to offer. And though she was taken from this world in a senseless act of violence, her dreams continue to resonate. Her legacy lives on through the memories of those who knew her best, the family, friends, and even strangers who have been touched by her story. Her passion for helping others, her warmth, and her spirit will forever be part of the fabric of those who loved her. Every person who was impacted by Laken's life remembers her not just for how she died, but for the kindness she spread, the lives she touched, and the difference she made, no matter how short her time on this earth was. Laken's death serves as a stark reminder of the fragility of life. It underscores the importance of cherishing every moment, of taking nothing for granted, and of fighting for justice when it is needed. Her story is a call to action, a reminder that victims of violent crimes deserve justice, and that no one should ever be forgotten in the pursuit of truth. Thank you for taking the time to watch Laken Riley's story unfold. It's important that we continue to reflect on cases like this, where lives are tragically cut short and the fight for justice becomes not just about the law, but about ensuring that the memory of the victims remains alive in our hearts. Stories like Laken's challenge us to stay vigilant in our efforts to protect others, to seek justice, and to ensure that the voices of the victims are heard. As you reflect on Laken's story, remember that we all have a role to play in the fight for justice. Stay informed, share the stories that matter, and keep pushing for a world where tragedies like this no longer occur. If you found this documentary compelling, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We'll continue to bring you more true crime stories, in-depth analyses, and discussions that matter. Your engagement helps keep the conversation going, and it ensures that we never forget the lives lost, the stories told, and the lessons learned. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for more.